Czechoslovakia.
Good afternoon. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting bird's eye. Alright, next step on this is going to be cutting in a skyline. I'm intending on using the various layers of blue here as increasing levels of atmospheric perspective for the development of the clouds. They're already pretty much there, but I just need to detail them and make the shadows and highlights a little bit more pronounced. But for the top corners, maybe a little right here, and then over here, I'm going to cut in some violet and blue for a sky color, a pure sky color, and also a sun right there. It shouldn't take too long. And then I might start playing with some highlights, depending on how much time is left.
Michael Harner, who is an anthropologist, also a shaman himself, he accuses the Western traditional scientific framework of being ethnocentric, being sort of culture-bound, and also he says it's cognicentric. That means it takes into consideration or takes seriously only what you experience when you are in the ordinary state of consciousness. It ignores any kind of serious data which are coming from non-ordinary states. It just doesn't want to deal with that whole area. That whole area is referred to the realm of pathology, something that doesn't have anything to offer, that we don't have to be interested in. And of course what happens, that you pathologize some of the best parts of human history. You know, all the saints, all the prophets, all the shamans are just a bunch of ambulant psychotics who had the luck that they lived in cultures that didn't have good psychiatry yet, so they got away. Not only got away with what they were talking about and experiencing, but they even get appreciation from their tribes and their cultures. So this is what I would like to talk about. If you now change your consciousness, if you go into a different state of consciousness, how you might experience yourself, how you might experience the universe, and what kind of insights you might get into who you are and what it is all about. And how that insight will differ from the one that we share in everyday life. And then of course there is the problem, how do you reconcile those two? That is the catch-22. If you have then two different ways of looking at things, how do you live with them? Which of them do you choose, honor, and under what kind of circumstances, and how do you dance, you see, between those two. This is where you can learn a lot from shamans. Shamans who feel very comfortable in both realities. They can choose the way they experience reality depending on circumstances. Now I'll start with something that's a sort of autobiographical memory, which will sort of frame it for you. When Christina and I met, she was a follower of Swami Muktananda. She was very much into Siddha Yoga. I had known at that time that Muktananda wrote this book, it was called at that time The Guru, later was known as The Play of Consciousness. Several of our friends actually were trying to mediate a meeting between us, but it somehow had never happened, so we never met personally. And when Baba came to Oakland, Christina of course wanted to see him. It was only 3 hours drive from Big Sur, and she very much wanted me to meet him because, you know, he was a very important part of her life. Yogic type is very much the Bhakta type, which is the devotional type. I never thought about myself as a Bhakta. In fact, let's think about those 4 different ways that you can take in yoga according to the Indian tradition. So I can really identify with Jnana Yoga, which is you push your intellect, you know, to the point where it can't go any further and has to surrender. That's one of my possible roads. The other one was Raja Yoga, which is the way of experiment. You do something with your mind and then you have certain kinds of experiences, and that sort of mediates your union with the divine. Karma Yoga was all right, but not great for me. And sort of, you know, Bhakta Yoga was somewhere way down on the ladder. And I had actually some experiences of my friends who were workshop leaders, and you know, they announced a workshop at Esalen, and they would go to an intensive with Muktananda, and then they show up sort of with, you know, eyes shining, and then the workshop comes and they just refuse to do what they announced or they promised, and they bring a little drums and a couple of cymbals, and they want to chant Om Namah Shivaya was the group. And so a few of my friends got into trouble, and it didn't impress me. I had a sense of, I had a sense of duty and obligation. If you promise a workshop and people come from all over the place, you should deliver what you were supposed to deliver. So I wasn't very excited about meeting Muktananda. On the other hand, I was very curious to see all kinds of phenomena that were happening in this sort of New Age scene. So I was a little ambivalent, but we ended up in the car going to Oakland. And we came about 20 minutes early and parked the car, and we were sitting in the car. We had what's called a personal darshan, which means just personal meeting with him. And as we were waiting, I said, why don't you tell me something about Muktananda? So I'm somewhat prepared for this. And so she started telling me, some things about him. And at a certain point, she said he was a Shaivite. And that really attracted my attention, because by that time I had had quite a few psychedelic experiences, in various contexts with various substances. And the experiences of the Shiva archetype were among the most powerful and meaningful. I really connected with that. And I had a long history of interest in Indian philosophy. My mother, when we were still in Czechoslovakia, was one of the followers of Paul Brunton. Some of you might know the name. He was a British philosopher who spent some time with Sri Ramana Maharshi, and then also went to Egypt. And he wrote books where he popularized spirituality. Books like Search in Secret Egypt, Search in Secret India, and so on. And then he traveled, and he had groups of followers, and he did meditations with them, and lectures, and so on. And so she belonged to one of the groups, and when I was 12, she actually took me to one of those groups. And this was my first exposure to Indian philosophy, and I was instantly interested. I would start sort of reading whatever I could get my hands on. And very quickly I knew more than the people in the group, theoretically. But then there was a problem that they were meditating, and I couldn't meditate. I'd sit down, my mind was all over the place. I felt, there's so many interesting things to do, would possibly just want to sit and be there. So it all stayed just in my head. And then later, when I was studying medicine, I took about 4 years of Sanskrit. Again, there was a pull towards India. And I loved to be informed about Indian philosophy, but it was a kind of like for coffee table discussion, like, when you're in a party and people talk about Hinduism, so you know what to say, you sort of know the terms. And it never occurred to me that they had any deeper relevance. I thought those guys on the Ganges didn't have enough to do, so they, said, and let me think what the universe works like. And then they came with these interesting ideas about it, and they made up these stories, fairy tales about Kali and Shiva and so on. And this was a tremendous surprise for me when in my psychedelic sessions all this came alive. I mean, I realized Hindu, Buddhist mythology, those are maps of consciousness. I mean, those are states that become as real as anything that you've experienced in your everyday life. So this was a tremendous surprise for me. And some of the most powerful experiences came in the context of the Shiva archetype. I actually illustrated in the book, The Adventure of Self-Discovery, the 4 perinatal matrices, with my own experiences from psychedelic sessions, and the most powerful ego, death, rebirth experience came as a confrontation with Kali, surrender to Kali, and then sort of being destroyed by the destructive aspect of Shiva, and then having what I felt was an Atma-Brahma union. So it was all in the Hindu framework. Some people with whom I discussed it, they said, well, you just have been exposed too much to Indian philosophy and Sanskrit, this stayed in your head, and this is why all this came. But I saw it the other way. I saw that that archetype was already working in me, and I was sort of attracted to these things like Brunton and Sanskrit because the archetype was there. It worked the other way. Because when it came alive, it was way beyond anything I had ever studied about these things. I mean, there was lots of details, and there was also this tremendous experiential power, the convincing quality of those experiences. So 2 of those experiences were, one was the ego death, when I felt that as I was being crushed, the ego was being crushed. I connected was the image of the dancing Shiva crushing the little dwarf under. And then later I found out that this is actually one aspect of meaning of that particular image. And then much later I had a very powerful psychedelic experience where I experienced something like this fantastic archetypal river that was the river of time and was sort of flowing back to source. Everything was being called back to the source of creation. And there was like a holographic image of the dancing Shiva. And there were sort of, I saw dinosaurs, you know, the whole species originating and then sort of being there for a while and then going into this river and being sort of carried back to the source, and civilization sort of originating and coming back. So the whole image of Shiva was something extremely, extremely important for me. And so when I heard Shiva and Shaivite, I became instantly a little more interested. And I also knew that the dancing Shiva has a datura plant in the crown, and there's datura growing around many of the Shiva temples in India, and they actually use datura as a sacrament, which is a very powerful psychedelic plant. So at that point I knew that he, you know, had all kinds of experiences that we can sort of communicate about. So by the time the darshan came, you know, within those 15 minutes, my expectations sort of really way up there. I also told Christina those two experiences, I never discussed them, which I had had with Shiva in that car during those 15 minutes. And then we walked into the ashram. It was time for the darshan, and I walked into the door, and Muktananda asked me to sit down by him. And then he did what he seldom did, which was he took off his glasses. He always wore dark glasses, and then he looked into my eyes from about 4 inches, sort of just studying, looking something. And then he sort of patted my shoulder and said, "You're a man who has seen Shiva." He says, "Very good, this is very good." And that just absolutely blew my mind. You know, so this is, I mean, you know, yeah, you know, there are coincidences, but this looked like this was a little too much. And then we started talking, and the subject was basically psychedelic plants. We were talking about soma, which was very much my interest. It was clear that there was a psychedelic plant, there was a psychedelic potion, which was a sacrament and became the source of all of the Vedas. You know, a lot of the stanzas in Rig Veda are about soma, how it grows, how you prepare it, and then what happens to people when they take soma, half of them being on the earth, half of them being in heaven. And the potion was considered so powerful that it was given the name of the god. Soma is the name of the god. And somehow in the course of history, the secret of it got lost. Nobody knows now exactly what the plant was, and of course we cannot then identify what the active alkaloid is. And the part of me that is scientific really was having a painful experience that there was a missing link, and you know, if we could fill in that knowledge, you know, we would know more about psychedelics and how the mind functions and so on. So one of my interests was, you know, to find out somehow what soma might have been. So we started talking about it. It turned out that he knew that soma was still being used in India, and then on his birthday there were Vedic priests coming down, and they were actually taking soma ritually. Later he actually wanted to arrange for us a meeting with these priests, and then we were supposed to go there in May, and in October he died, so we never really connected with this tradition. But anyway, so we talked about soma, and then he went and started talking about ganja, about charas, about bhang, you know, which are the different marijuana type derivatives of hashish, and how people use it wrong in the West, and how some of the Brahmins do it right. You grow it sort of with a lot of reverence, and you soak it in water for 14 days, and so then they smoke it, you know, chillams, and then they lie on the ice in the Himalayas in ecstasy. So we spend, you know, the darshan pretty much talking these kinds of things, and I thought this is the way it's going to stay. The darshan was slowly coming to an end, and then Suddenly Baba reached sort of behind him. There was, in the ashram, there was a thing about sweets. There was a place called the Amrit, which was a shop that had the best and the sweetest confections and sweet tea and coffee, Siddha Yoga coffee. And he was always giving candy as prasad. He said that Shakti likes candy, likes the sweets. So he had a big can of almond roca, and he sort of reached for it, took a couple of them, shoved it into my mouth, and then was sort of slapping me over the head, over the face, and then also kicking me in the shin. And then he sort of lifted me and was pushing me out of the door. And Christina was sort of following, and then on the way he said, we'll be having 2 intensives here, which were kind of weekends, like something like what we are doing here, where people meditate, and he was also giving what's called Shaktipat, sort of awakening of Kundalini. And he said, we'll have 2 consecutive intensives. They are on Kashmir Shaivism. He says, it's going to be very interesting for you. Just come as my guests. And that was it. We ended up in front of the door. There were people lined up, because as you know, in these spiritual centers, a lot of people had psychedelics that opened them for spirituality, and then they try to find some other ways of entering those spaces. So in many of these ashrams you find people who have some psychedelic history. So there were all these people within Siddha Yoga who had done some psychedelics and had some conflicts about it and didn't know if Baba approved or didn't approve. And they knew that if we have some conversation, the psychedelics very likely would come up. So did Baba talk about LSD? And what did he say about psychedelics? And I felt tremendously reluctant to discuss anything with anybody. I felt something was churning in my head. And I wanted to be alone. I wanted to know what was happening. So there was a large hall in Auckland, and I walked to the furthest corner. I sat down with my back into the corner, and I closed my eyes and went into meditative state. I wanted to know what was happening. And like within a second, I just completely lost it. And I went into this place which was the void, which was, the closest thing I can compare it to from the phenomenal world was like being somewhere in the middle of the universe, interstellar space, where there is absolutely nothing, there are no celestial bodies. Just a sense of total emptiness, vastness, and just incredible peace. There was still consciousness there, but there were no realities around me. And when I opened my eyes again, there's lots and lots of time passed, and I just had no recollection. It was just absolutely empty space, and that impressed me because. First of all, I had a couple of almond rocas and those slaps where I thought that was a pretty good technique, for evoking that kind of depth of an altered consciousness. But there was something else, which was an element of absolute surprise, because I had some intellectual understanding of Kundalini and Kundalini Yoga, and my idea about it was that it's associated with kriyas, which means you will have powerful emotions and there will be, shaking and there would be energies. And the idea that you would just go into this state of extinction was just not part of my expectations. Had I been twitching or something like that, I would have had less respect because it would follow my expectations, and the mind can create all kinds of things. So we were driving back, and I said, this has been quite interesting, and how would you feel if we, go to these 2 intensives? I didn't know at that time what Kashmir Shaivism was, although I knew,
All right,
forms
I think for the next step I'm going to have to get into some Payne's Grave or some shadows, but I'm going to keep that subtle because I really like the brilliant blue that is sort of dominant throughout the cloudscape there. The highlights kind of do a nice job of bringing out some layering. For the moment, I think that's it. So that's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting bird's eye. Thanks for watching, and have a good night.
Basic theoretical stuff was covered by somebody called